The mere assertion of faith is not enough. Faith is not just an assertion of facts, but rather Christ-like acts. An intellectual faith does not save. In fact, Jesus says in Matthew 7, verses 18 and 20, a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. He says in verse 20, thus you will recognize them by their fruits. So does your walk match your talk? I heard of a tightroper in the early 1900s who would have a part of his act, this engagement with the crowd, as a means to kind of gather an audience and a popularity in the region of New York where he was living. And so sure enough, this man was incredibly gifted. He would take this tightrope and it would be escalated above the ground, just several feet way up there, and he would walk across and he would begin to engage the audience and says, okay, now who thinks that I can do it again? And they would raise their hand, I think you can do it again, and so we'd walk across. Well, then as his popularity began to gain, his act began to compound. And so no longer was it just walking across this tightrope, he would grab a wheelbarrow. He would walk across this tightrope with a wheelbarrow. Who thinks that I can do this? We do. Now he says, so who thinks that I can push a person across this tightrope in this wheelbarrow? We do. And then he looks at them and says, do I have any takers? And then he would turn to them and say, you do not have faith. You have simply the idea of faith. And that's James' exact point here. This is why James is so insistent on the need for our faith to be expressed through actions, because a non-working faith does not work. The saving faith, true faith, real faith, inevitably is verified in our hearts through fruit in our lives. Epictetus, the great Greek philosopher, was right when he says circumstances do not make the man, they only reveal him to himself. So faith that does not have works, can that faith save him? No, James says. And he goes on to illustrate this point by giving two hypothetical situations in verses 15 and 16. He says, for if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace and be warmed and filled, without giving them the things they need for the body, what good is that? James here describes a Christ follower, a believer in the assembly, in the church of Jerusalem, who for apparently quite some time had been poorly and inadequately dressed, and had been in this habitual need of food and in this dire need of help. And here he was in and amongst God's people who knew him, who saw him. And they just simply say, go in peace. Now I'll remind you, this go in peace here is a common biblical blessing. There's nothing wrong with it. What's wrong is the mood it's in. It's conveyed with this sense of this sarcastic indifference, this false compassion. James implies here that these Christ followers had the resources to help, but yet offered no assistance at all. Their words were full. Go in peace, be warmed and blessed. But yet their actions were empty. Real faith meets a need to the best of your ability. Real faith moves. Real faith desires to make an impact as the Lord leads. You're seeing that right now through our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. Obviously, there's many things in that region that is incredibly humbling, heart-gripping. But what is profound is the actions of Christ followers through this calamity. That you have our brothers and sisters in Christ, those shells are flying all around them, are humbly gathering together in Kyiv, praying outwardly. That we have reports of Ukrainian soldiers who are Christ followers, who are not only equipping Ukrainian citizens to be in Ukraine's army, but are also sharing the gospel, asking them to be in the Lord's army. You have the president of a Baptist Theological Seminary in Kyiv, who basically says, well, if the Russians won't allow us to worship outwardly, we'll just meet underground. We've done that for decades anyway. We're here. Christ is alive, and we will preach his gospel. I don't know about you, but I'm inspired. I mean, how fortunate are we as men and women, boys and girls, of freedom, to have a greater responsibility to live out the faith that our brothers and sisters in Christ are living in captivity. Meeting the needs of others for Jesus is not this meaningless duty, but rather is to be a joyous delight. It is to be a privilege of the few that Christ has saved and multiplied to make an impact. And just as words without actions profited this poor person nothing, so faith without works profits nothing for the Christ follower. In fact, look at verse 17. James says, so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead, he says. Dead faith produces no works. Why? Because it is ineffective, worthless, lifeless. James is so adamant about this point that he mentions it 5 times in verses 14 through 26. His point is that a faith that does not move us closer to Christ, that does not compel us to live outward for Christ, is not saving faith. For faith that produces nothing is nothing. Real faith cares by caring. Real faith loves by loving. Real faith moves to action. For saving faith is in Jesus alone. But saving faith is never alone. Living faith is a moving faith.